Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We are experiencing some technical issues. We have a very interesting program for you all. So first, for the ones who don't know 5G-MOBIX, I would like to come on cross-border corridors, which is organized by 5G-MOBIX. And I think we have a very interesting program for you all. So first, for the ones who don't know 5G-MOBIX, I would like to briefly go over the project, and then we'll go to the agenda and we'll introduce the speakers to all of you. Let's start. 5G-MOBIX. 5G-MOBIX is one of the ICT 18 projects that has been granted a project. It's part of the Smart, Green and Integrated Transport topic from the Societal Challenges group. And if you look at the goal of ICT 18 is to qualify 5G as a core technology for CCAM, for actually CAM, because we're not looking into the connectivity part. So how do we do that? We look at a technical perspective, a business perspective, and the use cases we use should be aimed at automation levels 4 and 5. We also try to demonstrate the benefits of 5G in innovative business models, to open the door for private investments, because it's very necessary, and to open the door for broader digitization of the automotive sector. These two are key to get CCAM or CAM on the road. And we support the strategic objective with this to have a major transport, all major transport paths covered by 5G in 2035. And one of the major things there is we need to check the cross-border trials to ensure that coverage is seamless, etc. So 5G-MOBIX itself, what is it? It's a project runs from 2018 November to July 2022. And it encompasses 50 partners from 11 countries in Europe. In the near future, it will be 51. 10 non-EU funded partners from China and South Korea. And the objectives are to accelerate the deployment of 5G at cross-border areas. We do that by trials to assess the capabilities. And we qualify the 5G infrastructure with that. With this, one of the parts is defining deployment scenarios and recommendations. This is directly related to this workshop. So it's cost-benefit analysis, new business opportunities, and investigating legal and regulatory and security issues. So what trials will we do? These are the locations. So it's 2 cross-border corridors, one in Spanish, the Spanish-Portuguese corridor, and the Greek-Turkish corridor, which is an interesting one because you also have a legal boundary. It's a real hard border. We have 4 complementary European trial sites. We can't do everything in a cross-border corridor, so we complement it with national sites. And we have 2 ones in Asia, one in Korea and one in China. The network that we use is 29 5G G0Bs, and initially we deploy an NSA architecture with the potential for evolving to SA, but actually we're also doing SA. The number of vehicles we will employ is 20 SAE level 4 automated vehicles, which is quite advanced. It's good. And the use cases that we employ can be categorized in these 5 groups, such as advanced driving, vehicles platooning, extended sensors, remote driving, and vehicle quality of service support. We can't do it alone, of course. We have 50 partners, and that's these organizations. It's quite a number. So what do we have today for you? This is the agenda. If all went well, you should have received it earlier. It's the welcome. We have a 5G for CAM cross-border projects by Jorge Pereira. Actually, all the presenters, could you show yourself so I can introduce you? Presentation by Diana and Daniel. Diana, perfect. Can you show yourself as well, Diana? Perfect.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good morning. My name, can you see? Okay, right now. Good morning. My name is Diana Blanco. I work at CTAC. I'm going to present together with David Fidalgo the work done in task 6.1 in relation to the technical enablers from 5G-MOBIX cross-border corridors and trial sites in the framework of the 5G-MOBIX project. This is the content of this presentation. The first, the objectives and main activities of both Work Package 6 and Task 6.1 will be presented. We will continue with the methodology to proceed with the two main activities of the tasks that are called from local to project and from project to global. And finally, an example of expected results and the next step within the task to achieve the different objectives will be presented. Well, 5G-MOBIX dedicates the Work Package 6 deployment enablers to the analysis of the deployment enablers for large-scale 5G deployments across corridors. Our fundamental objective is to ensure the project reaches the highest level of impact on real deployment business, standardization, regulation, and policy making during and after its lifetime. The work package is divided into 4 tasks. The task 6.1, recommendation and deployment options. The task 6.2, adoption of new business models for CAM. The task 6.3, standardization and spectrum allocation. And finally, the task 6.4, Euro policies and regulation. This first one, the recommendations and deployment options, is the one we will focus on this presentation. The objectives of these tasks are to demonstrate how 5G telecommunication infrastructures can be applied to the transport sector and to contribute to the taking to market of concrete services and products that are successfully applied to 5G-MOBIX use cases. Also, to contribute to the creation of a multiplier effect on project results by implementing a two-side recommendation and deployment strategy called from local to project to global that I'm going to explain in the next slide. First, from the local to project task, the main activities are to identify successful innovations in the transport sector at local level and to promote the integration of successful innovations coming from external stakeholders into one of the project use cases. Secondly, from project to global task, the objective is to support the market take-up of concrete innovations and services demonstrated in the project use case, both to innovation coming from external stakeholders and innovations brought by project partners by agreement between innovators, technology adopters, and private investors. And finally, we will provide recommendations and deployment options. Regarding the methodology, the first stage is based on the analyzing the technology as well as the required needs of 5G to support the different requirements of the CAM functionalities. The second stage has to do with monitoring the industry through interviews and the review of the current projects, which will allow us to analyze the stakeholders involved in the value chain of 5G for CAM. We will also look at the costs that affects the deployment of the technology. And finally, there are recommendations for the deployment of 5G for CAM to be validated and prioritized. In relation to the technology, there are a large variety of use cases related to the autonomous and connected mobility, and proof of these are the different use cases of the 5G-MOBIX project, the following to the categories of advanced driving, vehicles platooning, extended sensors, remote driving, and quality of service support. Although it is difficult to present general requirements, it could be said that there is a consensus in relation to 4 main requirements that are latency, coverage, bandwidth, and reliability. For this purpose, 5G network seems to be the best networking option due to the following reasons. 5G networks are fully virtualized, so they can be very flexible with many different services that can take advantages of the concept of network slicing to provide different kinds of services of CAN with different requirements. Applications can be installed in any operator network, and the radio bands allocated for 5G network mobile operators are providing a lot of capacity that can be used by the CAM applications. In practical terms, we should consider 4 important aspects. First of all, the envisioned scenarios. This is critical to dimension the project deployment and targeted deployment costs. Some scenarios that have already been presented in some studies at the European level are presented here. In the minimum scenario, the reference is the minimum bit rate observed on the current tests. The classical scenario is based on the critical data that should be transmitted in any traffic conditions. The breaking scenario is based on all 5G CAM use cases, including those that are more specifically designed for the driver. And finally, the future-proof scenario. In this scenario, the network will support any conceivable future service, including equipment every 400 meters and bit rates of 100 megabits per second. Secondly, we have the technology readiness as an important aspect. This is the availability of the technology in the border countries and the deployment readiness. Most of the current 5G systems, both 5G core and 5G radio, and the user equipments which are being commercially deployed right now are based on the 3GPP release 15 standard. As a third aspect, we have the frequency availability. This is the available spectrum in the different countries and impact on massive services deployment. The image from the 5G Observatory website shows the spectrum distribution in Europe, China, Japan, South Korea, and United States in relation to the low, medium, and high bands. In black, we can see the assigned spectrum, and in red, we can see the unassigned spectrum. So at the European level, it can be seen that in low and medium bands, more than half of the spectrum is still pending assignment. And in the high bands, practically all of the spectrum is pending assignment. The last aspect would be the agreements between the telecommunication operators required to implement an efficient and global solution for the automotive market. There are 2 approaches for implementing the sharing of mobile infrastructure. This is the passive sharing, in which the equipment shared between the different mobile operators is limited to the passive network elements, and the active sharing that extends the list of the shared equipment to include the transport infrastructure, baseband processing resources, and potentially the radio spectrum. With this agreement, network operators can save important costs. For example, in the case of active sharing, including a spectrum, CapEx saving between 33% and 45% are expected. This also applies to OpEx costs. In addition, other advantages can be associated to network sharing, like environmental benefits by reducing energy consumption and customer experience by improving the quality of services, the coverage, and the data speed. Having seen the technology, it is time to take a closer look in the industry, following in detail the activities related to the different organizations and associations involved in 5G4 CAM. As my colleague David will comment later, interview with the different associations are planned to validate the work carried out in this task by the industry. In addition to this, the different projects related to 5G and CAM have been analyzed, and it can be seen how the 5G corridors are beginning to expand throughout Europe with RAN, core, and architecture as main topics with the largest investments. It is precisely the study of the industry that allows us to know the different stakeholders that participate in value chain. Thus, we have the end users who enjoy 5G CAM services and pay for the service, OEMs who enables 5G CAM for end customers and provides data to cloud or MEC and pays for the communication fee and cloud hosting, the cloud MEC provider who hosts the 5G CAM service applications and pays for data acquisition and communication fee, and the governments who provides the communication for 5G CAM services, invest in network infrastructure and pay licenses and taxes to the government. Sorry, the network operators, the network equipment provider, the road operators who provides data and enables 5G CAM services and investing in infrastructure, the RSU provider, and finally we have the policymakers who define the legal framework and the standards developing organization who define the standards from the common usage of 5G for CAM. In relation to the costs, the partners involved in this task have identified different costs associated with the deployment of 5G for CAM, both at CAPEX and OPEX level in the following categories: telecommunication related costs, automotive OEM costs, cloud costs, and road operator costs. However, the emerging state of the technology prevents the different partners of the 5G-MOBIX project from sharing the economic data for confidentiality reasons. For this reason, a bibliographic reference search was initiated based on project and specialized articles and publications. First, the available deliverables of the three phases different projects associated with the 5G PPPP were analyzed. It is concluded that the very limited information is currently available on the European projects to the deployment, mostly related to the deployment of 5G infrastructure, perhaps due to the confidentiality reasons that we mentioned before. However, there are studies based on the different scenarios that we have discussed before, and depending on the scenarios, deployment can vary significantly, as can be seen in the table. For example, for the same cost for the deployment of the 5G site, civil works can vary between 17,000 euros per kilometer in the case of the minimum scenario and with an intersite distance of 4 kilometers to 181,000 euro per kilometer in the case of the future scenario and with an intersite distance of 400 meters. As you can see here, economic data are also available for the RSUs, which follows a similar pattern. Given this, we started with the task from local to project. In this task, 43 innovations in the transport sector were identified at the local level by the different partners. And these innovations were linked to the areas in which they could be of interest for our project. And in a future second phase or second step, we will proceed to score them and select those that provide the highest value in order to select one that can be incorporated into one of the user stories of the 5G-MOBIX project. In relation to the task from project to global, this is divided into the step one, the establish of trilateral agreements that will be presented in the next deliverable 6.5, and the step two, that is for providing recommendations and deployment options, in which we will focus right now. First of all, it's worth mentioning that Work Package 2 already identified the cross-border issues in the areas of telecommunication, application, security and data privacy, and regulation, and that these cross-border issues are being reviewed transversally by the experts in the project to update the recommendations that can provide the different cross-borders and trial sites with the knowledge acquired in the lifetime of this project. On the other hand, the partners involved in this task have proposed recommendation in the framework of 5G for CAM that fit into the following categories: legal, deployment, data quality and validity, data property management, application, fixed onboard infrastructure, and cybersecurity recommendation. However, we are currently working on a new recommendations approach that will allow the alignment of the recommendations between the different tasks in Work Package 6 and the proposal of goal the recommendation once the action that the BID is going to comment are carried out. So David, whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Hello everybody, my name is David Fidalgo. I'm the Vice President of IBAC, and we were supporting this particular Work Package 6 in combination with Diana with the rest of the team. So as Diana mentioned, one of the tasks we're trying to do now is actually going for 73 recommendations to actually creating what we call the golden rules or the golden recommendations. So the process we're following is we initially assessed all the challenge of the 5G CAM in Europe for the different work packages to understanding basically what was the main issues and recommendations, and then trying to define areas that all that issues challenge actually can be categorized to providing a set of recommendations based on those particular areas. Then what we'll do is just combining some of the different parts of the issues. We believe that the recommendation need to be actually bringing as well, need to be in conjunction with the industry approach and some of the standards that are actually in the industry. So we're trying to write some of the recommendations that they contain some of the guidance on standardization or actually industry approaches that is in the market currently, to help us to go to a deployment plan that actually could be applicable for basically with a view of applicable to the whole Europe as well, focusing on what we call the macro level, that is the European level, and then the micro level into the corridors and the countries where the trials are being working with. So is the next slide, Diana, please. So by doing this particular exercise, we actually find 4 different areas of categorizing the issues challenge and how we're going to be trying to categorize the recommendations. First one is the 5G. That is basically we are trying to focus on the network integration, performance, business models, and deployment. The 5G architecture, that we actually understand that as the whole architecture of the system. So basically we include the vehicle architecture of the level 4 SAA vehicles, the edge, the road infrastructure, the network integration, and the digital infrastructure as well. Then another key part that we see that it's quite pivotal to this particular exercise is reviewing the legal and the standardization that is being actually developed for different government bodies across the world, because I think we are a community of in technology. We're collaborating a lot with different countries as well, and there's a lot of standards and legal guidance for different bodies to support as well these recommendations. And the last one we're looking about as well is just to understanding the stakeholder collaboration. So how is the recommendations to collaborate with the whole stakeholders, because there's a big important point of all these exercises, understanding as well how we can move forward and how we can collaborate better between the different stakeholders of the industry. So next slide, please. So what we're we actually were doing a preliminary study to understanding how many issues that we have or challenge that they actually align with the recommendations, and we initially starting with I think in total 91, of the 72 recommendations, and we are trying to reduce it to basically, as I said, currently we are in the process of doing this, but basically we think that we can actually reduce it to between 20 and 25. Currently we are with 19, but I think we're still discussing some of them to understanding which is the best way to written the recommendations. So the intention that we have is that we have what we call it the golden rules, right? Or the golden recommendations. The sooner the better. And then in order to validate the recommendations, you go to the next slide. Okay, sorry. So this is just to give you an example of the recommendation, right? So basically, that's the way we were doing this work. For example, we for people that wasn't aware of how we select this particular work with these particular areas, we actually have several number of issues challenged, right? With a short description, and we actually starting to group in some of these particular issues on depending of the areas that we actually think need to be related, and providing just one recommendation covering all these areas. I mean, it's a little bit small, but if you can read as well, there's actually the recommendations, they actually based on guidance on the technical standards, for example, and the standards that we think there will be an impact onto these particular issues or areas, right? So next slide, yeah. So as I said, as the next steps, one of the things we're going to do to validate this is as well all the recommendations per area. We're starting to review some of the 5G standards and documents as well that are actually discussing some of the challenge for and providing guidance or recommendations for the deployment of the 5G for autonomous vehicles. We also basically we're preparing a set of interview with industry experts to discuss with them the recommendations as well, and make sure that we're following some of the industry approach as well that they're following some of the legal standards and recommendations that the organization is starting to utilize for actually deployment some of these activities, or they're working on it for developing in the next years. We also starting to review all the legal and standards that actually have an impact on the deployment of 5G and autonomy. Two things. One is which is the standards actually they're already deployed that we can be utilized for these particular deployments, as well as identifying gaps that we actually can include in the recommendation to then prioritize that recommendation to be looked at for the European community. Stakeholders as well, what we're trying to do as well is starting to have some level of interviews to learn how is the best way to do collaboration between all these different stakeholders as well, and understanding as well how we can include that particular ideas into the recommendations related with this area. Next slide, please. Then one of the things we're going to do is trying to, when we have these 22 to 25 golden rules or recommendations, what we're trying to do is creating a prioritization, one evaluation criteria to prioritize the rules, the recommendations, sorry, based on four main areas. One is the stakeholders, so understanding the impact on the stakeholders of the projects. Then understanding the impact in Europe in basically four different areas. So basically one in the technical, competitive value, and business value. Then the criticality, that the way we actually want to define the criticality is how time critical the recommendations need to be done to remain competitive, to actually provide an initial prioritization as well. So what areas we need to be working first. And then understanding as well based on that evaluation criteria, we were trying to understand the life cycle cost and the return on investment that it could provide to the region. And that's kind of like the way we were trying to prioritize the 22 to 25 golden recommendations that we're trying to achieve in the following weeks. And I think that's next. Yeah, that's all. So, okay.
Then thank you, Diana and David. Next up is Jorge Pereira from the EC.
focus, and I think it's really important that you have been looking into deployment enablers. So I will focus more on challenges and enablers for the deployment of 5G for CAM and cross-border corridors. And the reason I keep mentioning this cross-border corridors is that in fact there are specific challenges that come with cross-border corridors that I will emphasize here. I think you are seeing this now. So just to put this in context, the 5G action plan called for coverage of the main transport corridors and not only road by 2025. But things have changed with the Recovery and Resilience Fund. We need to go from an aggressive rollout to achieve 5G for all urban areas and along major transport corridors by 2025 to a much more, even more aggressive rollout with broad to provide 5G everywhere by 2030. Okay, with the money from the RRF, we need really to this in conjunction with, and I will end revisiting this with the CEF2 funds in the next framework program. We really need to expedite coverage of all these major transport corridors across Europe. The measure of the substantial investments in fiber infrastructure and small cells. These investments should have started already, but this we are here is a little bit out of date. But what is important that we have now to again shift the focus, accelerate this, sure that by 2030 5G will be everywhere. Again, why cross-border? Two major challenges: coverage in these mostly rural, certainly remote areas. Broadband connectivity throughout without gaps and discontinuities is a major problem. And specifically for CAM, seamless provision of advanced CAM services, some require real-time, is an even bigger challenge. It's a challenge identified broadband market failures, at least mild market failures in all member states. Okay, obviously that are member states with failures, but even in the more the richer countries, there are still problems with this is why we need to invest in those areas where there are more problems, more or less likely that the market will address them as we would expect. We had the first 5G cross-border corridors for CAM call, of which you are one of them. I'm quite happy to see that the three projects will come to discuss how are we focusing on these deployment issues. The three projects were launched in November 2018, and as you have seen already, a lot of good work going on. And now this workshop, okay, we started almost more than a year ago on the deployment issues, is a way again of accelerating and preparing contributions towards the future. We have invested, and it's important, this number are covering. In red are the projects from the first call, and in white the projects from the second call. We are already investing 105 million euros of EU to focus on specific corridors and together build an image of what are the problems, specificities of the different corridors, to have a perspective that would then serve, as it was mentioned in the previous presentation, for look towards replication in other corridors across Europe. But let me focus on the major challenges, okay? And they have to do, specifically for the cross-border corridors, they have to do with real-time services, with continuity of services, and more importantly, continuity of real-time services in the cross-border scenarios. This is where I want to focus. We discussed this on the workshop. There are technological, business model, legal and regulatory, security and privacy, reliability and availability, and liability issues that need to be addressed. But again, I will focus more on the technological side. But let's start with the business models, which were covered before, so I'll go. We need to bring together all the stakeholders, as it was mentioned, but we need to move from a competing to cooperating business models, because there is a need to co-finance the necessary deployment. The necessary deployment, as it was already mentioned, is very, very quite expensive, and therefore, if all together, it will be quite complicated. And obviously, from the institutional side, there needs to be support and facilitation. And there is one of the aspects is to do exactly with spectrum availability, and certainly there the member states need to do their part. But let me again focus on the real-time issues. Certain critical CAM services require real-time connectivity, which is not possible in the majority of current deployments, and even Diana mentioned in a presentation. So considerable investments will be required. And again, we need to bring together to syndicate all the interest towards continuity of service, okay? We should not really force applications to be in order to deal with 5G for CAM deployments, okay? Yes, we need to provide APIs to application developers as new functionalities become available as we deploy 5G across these scenarios, but we should not really require the applications to be updated. This continuity of services need to be looked across all layers of the ISO stack. And one important area is exactly the whole issue of IP mobility, multi-homing, and related issues, okay? Obviously, there is a side aspect of all of this, which is IP security, which should not be neglected either. But it is very important that the continuity of service is not seen just across the radio. It's radio, transport through the core, but anyway, transport and then application layers. One important issue that has been raised before is this QoS or QoE based predictive handover. I would mention here that more than an over, again, in the context of CAM, it is important to do predictive roaming, okay? And in particular, predictive national roaming. If we use national roaming as one of the ways of reducing cost and expediting deployment, it is important that you do roaming as well. And this then applies again to the whole issues of IP continuity and session continuity, all this. Another issue that I would really call your attention to is this, and relates with the previous one, has to do with predictive and opportunistic caching, okay? If you are aware of the quality of service or quality of experience of your network, you can pre-cache and then allow for opportunistic delivery of service. So this aspect of continuity of service is something that is really important. Again, the objective is to go for 5G everywhere, there are many challenges, and the main one has to do with financing. Okay, main one after resolving the technological ones has to do with financing. There is a big gap, which was again just recently reconfirmed. 250 billion just to provide broadband in rural areas. It's a significant problem, and this is independent of the other guide on getting financing to deploy 5G anyway. Okay, even without going to the rural areas. So operators have to make after paying for their licenses. The involvement of stakeholders is a critical one, and important is the issue of coordination and coordination across borders, coordination of spectrum bands, coordination of spectrum channels, such that you can deliver the continuity of service again. You are aware of this. We are aware that in Horizon 2020, we invested, as I mentioned, 5 million euros. In the new framework program, we want to invest much more through Self2Digital to go into large-scale deployment. Very briefly, we are 5 million euros in Horizon 2020 to around 1 billion euros with Self2Digital, to which we are adding other public funding sources. So with the other public funding sources, it's more than one order of magnitude increase to go again from the pre-deployment to large-scale deployment. Obviously, this EU and other public funding is complements, in fact, the private investment that is required to deliver 5G, namely in these cross-border areas. And with this, I don't take much more of your time. Again, I just want to emphasize here that one of the reasons why we are focusing on the cross-border corridors is that there are specific challenges, namely relating to this continuity of service. So I would like to call your attention to this aspect that is certainly technological, but it is important that it is addressed. Okay. It is at your disposal, maybe at the end if there are any questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, George. Related to the questions,
okay.
I would like to remind everyone that there's a questions box. So please use it. We will take care of the follow-up of the questions anyway. So next up is, thanks, George, for your views.
Okay.
Next up is Tahir Sari from Ford.
Hello everyone, I hope everybody is safe and sound. So today I'm going to explain about the business enablers from the 5G-MOBIX user story perspective. I am Tahir Sari from Ford Otosan, and I'm responsible in 5G-MOBIX about the deliverable business model related deliverable, the 6.2. Today, let me pass this one. Yes, I'm going to use my pointer. Okay, content is going to be actually collected from our latest deliverable 6.2 that can be found in the 5G-MOBIX website. I will talk about the business model canvas that we developed for this project and the value network model to see the 5G for CAM stakeholder relationship and the motivation of the stakeholders, business-related gaps, recommendations, and the next steps for our study. Okay, let's continue with the business model canvas study. Actually, this is the traditional way to examine a business model. So we did this, but with a different approach. We did this business model canvas per user story in the cross-border corridors. So here an example of it, the platooning with See What I See application. You might know the platooning, but the See What I See application is basically about the leader of the leader vehicle have a webcam, and it streams the 4K video to the other vehicles, the follower vehicles, through 5G. So we call it see what I see application, but it's basically see-through application, and it can be called like this. So in our study, we think for every stakeholder almost. So think like if you are an OEM or road operator, you might be an MNO or onboard unit, roadside unit vendor or 5G vendor, or maybe you are the cloud provider. So we categorize these kind of stakeholders with the letters A, B, C, D, as you can see here. And these letters will be used from now on for all different business model sections. For example, the key partners, key activities. If it contains A, then that means this R&D, for example, is stand for the OEM and road operator. So let's go an example. For the platooning with See What I See application, you are an OEM, like automotive OEM. So who are your customer segment related or customers? So here is truck drivers, fleet owners, because this is platooning of the trucks in our user story. And if you think who are your customer relationship partner, how is your customer relationship? It's generally on-site support after sales. If you sell the product that supports the platooning with See What I See, and onboard maybe remote support and call center support, because it's all three has the A, letter A. And what are your channels? For example, for platooning with See What I See application, you direct sales, go to the fleets and just try to sell your products, right? So maybe you need to do maybe some application demos, and you need to do online marketing and advertising. You need to use advertising platforms to promote your application with See What I See. And of course, online stores can be used. And what are the value propositions? In here, platooning with See What I See is promoting, especially decreasing the logistic costs, and with the help of decreasing the fuel consumption, and also the reduction of the carbon dioxide emission, and also faster logistic operations, increased cruise safety with the help of the See What I See application and real-time monitoring of the assets. And the key activities, if you take a look, it's of course you need to invest on R&D, because the platooning with See What I See is not something traditional. It's something different. It comes from the 5G for CAM services, and you need to have this sales, marketing, and field support teams. And of course, your partners are for again for an OEM, tier 1 onboard unit suppliers, road operators. This is quite critical. And public authorities, you need to exchange so many information with them, and cloud providers for the platooning through 5G and See What I See through application through the cloud applications. So this is important. And key resources, vehicles, onboard units, roadside units. The 5G infrastructure is not in this case your key resource, because you are an automotive OEM, cross-border automation experts, and then the 5G CAM application experts, and IP policies. Maybe you need to pay for some IPs, intellectual properties. And this is like this. And for cost structure, you need to maybe pay for the cloud usage, and you need to share your revenue with your partners, and also patents, sub licenses are other cost items for the platooning with See What I See application. And you are using so many data, like maybe gigabits, more than 10 gigabits, depends on the time that you serve this application, see-through application, for your customers. Then you need to pay for this data to the network operators, right? And revenue streams, revenue sharing, how is it going to be? And another open question for now. And we in this business model, we check with some options. We come with some options. Maybe per usage of truck routing, truck using, and maybe depends on the kilometer you used the platooning with CWAD-IC application, and depends on the fuel saving percentage of the platooning. And maybe you need to pay the monthly subscription fees for the connectivity. And also you might have a revenue from providing vehicle data to the other stakeholders, such as the cloud application developers. So this is the revenue stream opportunities. So we have this business model canvas for all cross-border corridor user stories, and we examined exactly with this way, the OEM perspective, road operator perspective, and so on. And then we try to examine the value with the help of the value network model. How is the new way of stakeholder interaction? As you can see here, it's quite complex. It's not like the traditional services. The 5G for CAM services are quite complex, and lots of the new stakeholders coming in, but the main industries are automotive and telecom, of course. For in these circles, you can see OEMs, tier 1 suppliers, component manufacturers, 5G CAM technology providers, and I don't want to read all of it, but also the similar approach is used for the telecom industry. But on the roadside infrastructure operators in here also supporting the telecom operators, and insurance companies, the other one, needs to come in for the OEM and the CAM service providers. If you take a look at the entire circle, outside of the entire circle, the policymakers and also R&D organizations needs to come in and interact with the other stakeholders. Here is there are two different dots, two different arrow types. One is the solid red arrow that indicates the indication of the equipment of or services, and then that means the flow of the payments will be in the opposite direction. And the dotted lines, dotted arrows, double-sided arrows, it indicates the relationship of terms of exchange of information, regulation, and policies. So if we examine the main industries like automotive, telecom, and roadside infrastructure, what are our main findings? So for the automotive industry, so 5G for CAM will bring new supplier, will extend the supplier chain. So you need to now have your telecommunication units in your automotive, in your produced car. So, and on the other hand, you need to have maybe some application partnership with other application providers, such as the HD map providers, and new onboard sensors, and also telecom units, as I mentioned. And that means also new hardware and software suppliers you need to cooperate. And also you need to keep in touch, work closely with the telecom operators to define your requirements, to align about your requirements. And then what about the telecom industry? Due to high capex and opex costs, deploying and operating a 5G for CAM services is a little bit high cost than the normal traditional 5G, only 5G deployment. In this case, you need to, MNOs needs to share infrastructure, spectrum, and maybe the core network resources in the future to provide seamless 5G CAM services. And you need to also have the various agreement with the technology as well as the policy and regulatory level. And you need to, in this case, stay close to other operators, and the collaboration between the operators needs to increase. and also not inside of the countries, but also between the different countries, with the neighbor countries. The MNOs needs to collaborate very closely. And automotive industry will embrace the embedded SIM cards, because embedded SIM cards are fixed and allow remote provisioning. And with this case, multiple MNO profiles can be used in a single car, and switching between the different MNOs will be easy. What about the road operators? Road operators here has an extra role, because they may provide infrastructure to MNOs, and especially the 5G network can help the MNOs about the 5G network deployment. For example, the masts, the fiber deployment, the cabinets, and the antennas, etc. And also, they need to provide geocoded information to facilitate autonomous driving. And the traffic management system here is going to be important. They need to invest about that. And some road infrastructure operators may decide to deploy and even operate their own 5G networks, and acting like an MNO for a certain road. So to cover to provide the needed coverage, and also requirement of the 5G camp services. Okay, so from this perspective, we create a value network model for each user story, cross-border corridor user story in our 5G-MOBIX project. Some of them here as an example you can see, and these R values are explained in the deliverable 6.2, the current version. But the main idea here is, you can see from the pictures, it's quite complex. It's not like a traditional application that you have in your mobile app now. So it's something different. It's something more, relationship is more close to other sectors, close with other sectors. So what are the motivation of the stakeholders? We also try to look from this perspective. What could be the motivation? So normally CAM means safety, comfort, and mobility for those unable to drive, and environmental sustainability. But what 5G will bring here, it's the improve the benefits of the CAM, and even but how can this be done, especially with the everybody knows probably the 5G triangle, but improved quality of service, very low latencies, improved throughput, and these new features will be the cornerstone for the CAM adaptation and the creation of the new businesses. With the help of the 5G features, the new CAM services will arise. If we take a look about, again, from MNO perspective, okay, MNOs will have chance to sell their 5G ultra reliable low latency communication infrastructures, because these will be needed for the 5G for CAM services. And then on the other hand, for the non-critical 5G CAM services, for example, in-car entertainment, it can be a traditional way for the business usual perspective for the MNOs. For in-car entertainment, for example, might need the huge data consumption. In this case, MNOs can sell their the connectivity products for this purpose. And also, business customers wants to connect their fleets to this system, to a cloud, and wants to have the quite control on their fleets. And MNOs can add value to such customers, providing reliable and secure connectivity within the private networks. I'm just going to a little bit fast Sorry for holding you. About the motivation of the OEMs, the 5G will, as I mentioned about the CAM, 5G for CAM will bring fully autonomous and connected vehicles faster than expected. Because of the help of the 5G, platooning, remote driving, extended sensors, this kind of features will be achievable. And sensor sharing through 5G, for example, vehicles will be equipped with less sensors because the other vehicles will have the sensors, and this sensor data, which can be huge, can be shared through the help of the 5G throughput capability. Okay, and about the software hardware suppliers, with the help of the 5G CAM services, the new, as I mentioned previously, new partnerships will be occurred, like today Google and Ford, for example, as I am a Ford employee, we are doing this kind of partnerships with the CAM providers. Also, we are doing some kind of agreements with the sensor providers and also we are having some agreement with the telecom operators to have the 5G CAM services enabled in the certain areas. And this will create a data economy and around the 5G CAM services, and sharing, collecting data for 5G CAM applications will be a new normal. About from now on, I explained the motivation and also some value network model and business model canvases. But now, what about the rated gaps? Business rated gaps. We use the PESTILE approach. It stands for the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental perspective, explaining and looking at the 5G for CAM services from these perspectives. From the political perspective, difficulties are the harmonizing and coordinating the policies and standardization between different companies and the countries. And the economical perspective, these are some examples, by the way. Lack of the motivation for investment in the innovative research and development might be a problem, and also the same for the lack of the investment from the sector that might benefit greatly from the 5G enabled CAM. Socially, public lack of trust to automated vehicles, 5G enabled automated vehicles, and also concerns around the security of jobs dependent on driving as a profession. And technologically, disparities in the capabilities of the EU member states, technical and legal issues, development of crash algorithms, stifling of customer choice with different technologies. These are the main so far we found in about the technological perspective. And the legal perspective, actually it is quite unclear how to ensure protection of the customer rights, and it's quite difficult to determine accountability in case of an accident occurred. And from the environmental perspective, development of environmentally sustainable but also economical and economically affordable vehicles currently is quite let's say not quite, but it's not easy like producing a traditional vehicle. And this is also same for the 5G equipments. What about our recommendations? Actually, most importantly, we need to create a cost-benefit analysis for the critical corridors to jumpstart developments. And this will showcase 5G for CAM can bring new opportunities for all MNOs, all stakeholders, And we need to analyze competitive forces in the cross-border corridors. So, for example, power of the suppliers and the buyers, and the effect of the new entries, etc. And by the fostering the new job creation and upgrading the skills in the existing workforce, will relieve the people who are concerning about their job security. And we need to create a data economy. For that purpose, 5G 4cam data pilots needs to be occurred, and also we need a way to utilize these data with the compromising our values and the GDPR. And the data the data can transform the data from transport sector, will create a huge data economy, especially for the better traffic management. Okay, we also need to have a clear liability borders, and also we need to determine the best use of public funds for 5G infrastructure. Improving the infrastructure for infrastructure can also increase the regional competitiveness and guarantee customer choice, avoid locking condition. The customer should be able to change operators and sell their cars, etc., and having open discussions about machine ethics. Okay, next step as a final, we prepared, by the way, the questionnaires in delivery 6.2. We will collect some answers, and with the help of this questionnaire answers to these questionnaires, with some other workshops, we need to improve our motivation, recommendation, and business-related gaps findings so far. And we need to examine the results of the other projects and we will compare it with our findings. And also we will collect data from our project trials, cross-border corridor project trials, and compare the value proposition so far we considered. Thank you very much, and waiting for your questions at the end of the presentation session.
Thank you, Tahir, for the interesting presentation as well. Again, if you have questions, there's a questions box. Feel free to use it, and we'll ensure that your questions will be taken into account in the Q&A session. Next up is Alain from Fraunhofer.
Perfect. So my name is Russo Claudio Alain, and today I'll present you the work of deliverable C.4, which links the policymakers and regulators with the industry from 5G for CCCAM. All right. Firstly, we're going to discuss about the plan and preliminary reports on EU policies and regulations recommendations. As 5G for CCAM enablers within 5G-MOBIX, the plan and preliminary report on EU policies and regulation recommendation present a complete cycle of requirements, gatherings, analysis, target, RUP, and framework identification, and finally a synthesizes exercise. This has resulted in a first step in a comprehensive overall view on the major issues that are of concern to the relevant stakeholders' deployment of 5G CCAM solutions. As a result, the following short-term policy and regulatory needs were identified. A common European understanding on necessary digital infrastructure quality coverage for level 3, joint approach between telecom and vehicle industry to support CAD, common European understanding on safety and security validation, when are the systems safe enough, and coordinate European and member state program to support global competitiveness. The adaptation of the road traffic rules in member state, and as well align general data protection regulation with European member state to ensure privacy. To achieve this, it is crucial that the existing and future policies to be implemented in order to align the roadmaps and priorities for coordinated 5G deployment across all EU states member, make provisional spectrum bands available for the 5G, promote early deployment in major urban areas and along transport paths, unite leading actors in working towards the promotion of global standards, and national and EU strategies available nationwide data on 5G deployment, including coverage and quality of the data. Execution of spectrum assignment by public authorities and 5G public funding for network deployment and RI. Reduce the cost and increase the speed of deployment of high-capacity networks by removing avoidable administrative hurdles. Common message sets and protocols dedicated to police interaction that would be standardized at international level, roaming and obvious implication of cross-border 5G CAM application and scenarios, and open internet and the implications for cross-border CCAM solution providers. For this, we developed a methodology and a plan to create the link between the authorities, the regulatory authorities, and the stakeholders of 5G for CCAM. In the first phase of the deliverable, it's mainly the monitoring of the specification in issues that are related to the deployment of trial sites and the cross-border coordination that relate to the policy, cooperation, and regulatory matters. The second phase of our methodology focus on the survey it's meant to gather the data for our stakeholders and to create a concrete idea over what regulations should be put in place. So that this phase consists of the internal review of the questionnaire and development of the wording, which is used to improve the understanding and clearance of the ambiguous questions, while keeping the support for all types of stakeholders implied in 5G-MOBIX and other like projects and initiatives. The third phase of the deliverable has the purpose to identify a list of EU-wide policymakers and regulators in order to develop a dialogue which will improve the pre-existing regulation and will move further to create the fundamental standardization regarding future laws over telecommunication, road operators, and network existing and future infrastructure. The main output for the third phase consists of the validation of gathered data internally and the confirmation of the information for the final survey feedback. The final part of this phase will be the same with the analysis of the external role gathered information, which is transported as recommendation and suggestion for the industry, from the industry, academia, and other entities to the EU-wide policymakers and regulators. Okay, further on, the deployment of 5G should follow an evolutionary path. Sorry. In order to account for future markets, needs to and technical development of 5G should coexist and be interpolated with other networks, such as the existing 5G LTE. The service continuity across borders and actors as main CCAM service, for example, the guidance and auto overtake, can be considered mission critical. There need to be reliable, uninterrupted connectivity and coverage with service continuity across borders and actors. End-to-end cybersecurity. A high level of end-to-end cybersecurity is necessary because it needs to ensure the trust on the CCAM service, but it also needs to be held to high performance and reliability criteria. 5G for CAM needs to be a multi-service, multi-application platform with standardized interfaces and data formats, and coordination among public and private actors in V2X for the deployment of 5G infrastructure is necessary as well. Starting from major corridors and highways, the benefits of 5G for CCAM can be demonstrated, and coverage can be then extended to secondary roads and urban areas. Public authorities and administration in charge of roads should collaborate for deployment of connectivity along major corridors. Cooperative planning and cost optimization is necessary to deliver improved network in a cost-efficient way, and the digital transformation for industry verticals must be accelerated as well. The current policy state of play. The EU strategy is to develop and translate into policy and initiatives by the European Commission. One of these AC as priorities as European fit for the digital age. This European approach to digital transformation is based on three main pillars: the technology that works for people, a fair and competitive digital economy, and open democracy and democratic and sustainable society. The European Commission is collaborating to achieve the EU's ambitious vision for connecting and automated mobility in the digital single market. The evolution in digital technology is quickly changing vehicles, so policies related to digital technology include cybersecurity, radio communication, data use, liability, privacy, and so on, and are becoming more relevant for the transport sector. The European Commission is supporting the deployment of CCAM with developing policies, initiatives, and roadmaps, developing European standards, co-founding research and innovation projects and pilots, and introducing European legislation. Some of these European initiatives that are worth to be shared are the 5G for European Action Plan, European 5G Observatory, 5G Security Toolbox, European on the Move, Third Mobility Package, Cross-Border Corridors for Connected and Automated Mobility, European 5G Corridors, Initiatives for 5G Corridors, Borders Coordination, Corridors Large-Scale Testing, the 5G Strategic Deployment Agenda for Connected and Automated Mobility, 5G Infrastructure Public-Private Partnership, or 5G PPP, Connecting European Facilities, CAF2, that is very important for our work package and for the whole 5G-MOBIX project, and CITS platforms. Some other initiatives that are worth to be mentioned are European Automotive Telecommunication Alliance, 5G Automotive Alliance, C-Roads platform, and Car-to-Car Consortium. Now I'll move on to the questionnaire. So for our purpose of linking the industry with and academia with the policymakers, we envisioned a whole questionnaire that will put straight to the access of the wide industry the questions and their problems, issues that can be solved by an overall policy that will provide their fundamental connectivity for all the technology for 5G for CCAM. So in other words, the task CISA4 in a cooperation with 6.1 and 6.3 created a first stakeholder survey provided in the format of a questionnaire to gather inputs on the stakeholder motivation status of cooperation with other stakeholders. The online questionnaire was set up by Fraunhofer IAO using the online survey tool Lime Survey, and the questionnaire has been disseminated with the 5G-MOBIX consortium in September 2020. During October 2020, the questionnaire is also disseminated externally to other stakeholders on the 5G-MOBIX website and social media with the sister project in ICT 18 and ICT 53 with 5G PPPP, with 5G EA and 5G GAA. Through the next link, as you can see. On the other hand, the questionnaire was partitioned in two sections. At the beginning, the stakeholders could provide information on their background, where are they coming from, and what is their main issue and their main domain of expertise, so that the questions will be relevant for them directly, and they won't have to answer or go over unsolicited questions. Further on, the issue for this was that for a statistical, a minimum of 100 participants should have been reached, and only a few responses of the stakeholder can be used to derive a recommendation for the policymakers and regulatory entities. Further activities will thus need to focus more on policymakers and national regulators. The first question addressed the main research area of academia and RD experts. The main areas are cooperative, connected, and automated mobility, application developers, and next generation networks. But due to the lack of response from the stakeholders, a second round of new data collection from CBC was realized. Over here, you can see the rate of answers. The biggest issue was that the questionnaire could be biased because of so many answers from the academia. So due to the risk of bias of the questionnaire have been updated with 4 crucial questions targeting the industries and technological stakeholders to overcome the high number of academia answers and to avoid possible issues that could come. The result will be merged with the survey data collection through the survey. The 4 questions are as follows. What is your implication in automated driving and the view on 5G in your company or research institute? Which are the most challenging issues related to the 5G for CCAM in your perspective? And which are the one related to your work or research activity? And which of them are X-border issues? How would you prioritize these challenges and what can be done from the policymakers and regulatory industries entities to overcome these challenges, and how can 5G-MOBIX influence the regulatory entities and policymakers to overcome these issues? Further on, the preliminary results were as follows. Mainly from the ICT sector, the main outcome were synthesized as a result in the recommendation section with the main purpose of closing the gap between the involved industries and policymakers. So from the ICT sector, more guidance should be provided by higher level authorities and how data should be stored, transferred, and shared. So need of protocols protected by policies. The government should push for regulating stakeholders on the type of data they provide across platforms, set requirements regarding data collection. Further on, from the other sectors, we had recommendations from the road operators, which stated that a higher level of automation that have road infrastructure requirements, such as surface making or telecommunication support, should require validation to be active. The communication in V2V and V2I must safeguard all aspects of privacy and secure data handling and making available only the relevant data to the involved parties. Higher level functions of 5G CAM, like overtaking or lane merging in mass transit or high performance road, may require arbitration between the involved parties depending on the implementation model. And from the car industry, we also received some recommendations, such as compliance with the at least FCC and CEM marking regulations. This should guarantee that the vehicle is able to operate legally in most of the countries. Regulation allowing platooning application in hard border crossing to be switched to remote driving by an operator or a cloud, because at hard border settings, platooning should be dissolved for security controls. The regulation and homologations processes in different countries should be unified, and to increase the speed of the security control process in border settings, additional sensor to monitor the goods or vehicle shall be mandatory. As well, common message set protocols dedicated to policy interaction shall be standardized in international level for suspicious events. Thank you, and don't forget to ask questions in the chat.
Thank you very much, Claudio, for your overview of the policy and regulation enablers. Next up is, we're running actually we're quite on time. That's good, 6 minutes late. So, Edwin, are you available?
Probably. Here we go. Okay, so this is my talk on behalf of the 5G PPP Automotive Working Group. We have an expert task force on cooperation models, and that was also requested by DG Connect, and George was, of course, very early on asking for this one. This is complementing the deployment studies, because cooperation is, of course, needed in terms of making it happen. And the question would be like, okay, what will it look like in the future, and what is then the way forward on cooperation models? So let's see, we dive into it once I get it rolling. Here we go. So first of all, couple of initial considerations for cooperation models. So what is the ecosystem landscape we do see currently, and which might, of course, evolve and change over time? But we have multiple MNOs per country. And I'm talking about the ones with nationwide frequency usage, right? So in some geographies, you might have regional operators which are not necessarily, say, the primary goal for to be considered for the provision of 5G for CAM. Like, for example, in Austria, there are also regional license allotments. But it's like talking about countrywide things. It's like typically you have a choice of between 3 and 4 MNOs per country. And then there are multiple tower companies in that game, so providing more or less tower infrastructures, and they are either associated with MNOs or they are a spin-off. Think of Vantage from Vodafone, recently got with the IPO went public. But there are also independent players coming from different ends, like American Towers, not only active in the US, by the way, but also in Europe, or the famous Cellnex, which is the biggest European player, which emerged from the old Bertis group. So more like, typical bricks and mortar business, I would say. And we have multiple tower companies being active per country or per region. So next, of course, the users, multiple vehicle OEMs and OEM groups, they all have their own choice of connectivity provider. So, and typically they look for having a more or less a permanent roaming regime on all available and preferred networks. Of course, permanent roaming only where it is available, and sometimes, like in Turkey, for example, you may not have a permanently roaming vehicle with a subscription from abroad. So in this case, you for a number of, say, regulatory reasons, it needs to be a local subscription, or at least ensure that you have local breakout of all the data flows and stuff. But as I said, there is quite a huge set, and not necessarily the connectivity provider of choice needs to be a European player. It could be even a player from North America, for example, or from any other place. And by the way, it's also the way around with connectivity providers from Europe also serving other geographies, even like rest of the world sometimes. With a few exceptions I already mentioned, like countries where you need to have a local provider. But we have an opposite to this one. We only have a single road operator who is in charge of a road or a road segment or a certain kind of road type, like for a national operator for example, for the motorway network. But it can be on national or regional or even local level, and it's like depending on the road type, of course, it can be anything, and it can be a public administrative entity or a private company, even a private company which is owned by the state or basically by authorities. It is in the end a private company, and of course, depending on the setting, they have say a certain right to play, but also certain limits to play when it comes to utilizing or leveraging infrastructures provided by road operators along the transportation or the road transportation networks. And then there is a more or less, call it new play coming into play that are connected and automated mobility service providers. And this is yet, I would say, rather unclear. Traditionally, there are vehicle OEMs with their private vehicle clouds. Like you have the car as a and the car cloud the vehicles are talking to. So that is a typical thing, but that might not be, say, involve all the necessary data and players and information coming from various entities on that end, but also road operators with their traffic management and information centers, for example, digital map providers, especially if you think of the say connected and automated mobility. Is like this is where you need to have high definition maps, and you need to have a dynamic layer on these maps which need to be constantly updated. And by the way, this is not just a downlink thing, like okay, maps being updated into the vehicles, but also the vehicles being used as sensors to capture any kind of anomalies along the road, and then again updating digital maps somewhere in the cloud. And the cloud could be anything from sitting somewhere on the internet, public and private cloud infrastructures or hybrid infrastructures, or down to edge cloud and multi-access edge computing cloud instances, so anything. And then there are completely new players emerging, like teleoperated driving centers, which could be again associated with a vehicle OEM, but also could be independent companies like maybe startups or whatsoever, or any kind of player in that game, but showing up in a new role basically. But this is something which is evolving, and by looking at the use cases, for example, in the 3 ICT 18 projects, and most likely also in the ICT 53 call projects, you can see it pretty much depends on the use cases. And if you talk about use cases like collision avoidance or cooperative maneuvering, like lane merge or whatsoever, when it's not so clear who will be the one providing that service. So in this case, there are still a couple of question marks. Nevertheless, CAM service providers could be or should be some or have a role in terms of cooperation models. So the second thing, the baseline for cooperation models, and now I'm just talking about the network, and especially in this case the radio access network, but not exclusively the radio access network, which is probably the biggest part when it comes to 5G deployment along road transportation corridors. And that is, of course, well, we have passive sharing of passive infrastructures, which is just sites or sites and backhaul. Could be also only backhaul, but rather unlikely. And then, of course, there is this huge area of active sharing, which is now here a bit simplified to so-called MORAN and MOCN, so the sharing of radio access resources or just the sharing of core network resources, basically, or no, of full radio access networks, including spectrum. But also then ultimately you could have full network sharing. And in this case, yeah, George already mentioned like national roaming, or in general, roaming is always something in that area. So there, in most cases across Europe, with the 27 plus member states and associated countries, think of, say, the wider geography of Europe is at least something like 40 countries or so. This is where you, in most instances, you will be roaming on your partner networks from an MNO perspective, and there is the home provider, which might be located in, at least from a subscriptions point of view, might be located in Malta, for example. Also, these subscriptions might be hosted somewhere in some core network anywhere in Europe, but nevertheless, with the exception of Malta, this SIM card will be roaming on any network across Europe, including, of course, states not belonging to the Euro 27 club. So this is more or less the game here, and I took it from GSMA and its infrastructure sharing and overview, and it's back from 2019. And to be very honest with you, even when looking at 5G and the famous slicing stuff overall, this is not fundamentally changing or adding a new column here like slicing. No, it's not. It's just a yet another variant or overlay in terms of certain network capabilities which could be made available for specific, well, either customers or use cases or whatsoever. So this is kind of a baseline. I would like to concentrate on the passive and the active infrastructure sharing, and probably treat them more like in common. And you know that there are lots of rules and regulation, not only harmonized in Europe, but unfortunately also dependent on the respective member state approach when it comes to what is allowed in terms of what you could do, like cooperating and sharing stuff. And spectrum sharing is not necessarily allowed in many countries. Site sharing, backhaul sharing, that's almost, the passive one is almost kind of I would say, a no-brainer, so a quick win. But when it comes to the active sharing of networks, then there is quite some variety to be observed across Europe, and Europe now more in a geographical, not in a political sense. So infrastructure competition versus infrastructure sharing. And to start with, one thing is like might be a simplistic observation, but there is no competition on road infrastructures. There is one road. There is not necessarily a competing road, at least not a competing motorway. You might have an alternative motorway running somewhere in some distance in parallel, but it is like there's only one road at one specific place, and you cannot choose to take the road from provider A or the road from provider B in most instances, at least. Maybe with the exception of some toll roads where you could also look for alternative routes. But what I wanted to say is like there's one ecosystem player per road or road type and region to be considered for cooperation. And that's a good message, but this is a starting point. And the other end in the telco space is completely different. There is at least some, call it limited competition, because it is to a certain degree a license play, at least when it comes to MNOs. But on associated mobile network infrastructure, there is competition, and passive infrastructures are more and more being shared. This is almost becoming as I said before, like a no-brainer. It almost has no limitations. There are limitations coming from a completely different end, and it's like you cannot put too much, more or less, radio signal energy being radiated over these towers or poles and masts. So there is a certain kind of threshold. So also some regulation in such regard, but and you probably cannot then put on a specific mast or tower site, put all the frequencies of all MNOs involved and eligible in that country or area to provide the service, because you might then cross certain kind of thresholds in terms of radiated radio signal energy. So there is a limitation, yeah. And there's also another limitation is, of course, the space on the tower is also limited. So there might be certain limitations, but in principle, passive infrastructures could be shared. And that also includes, of course, the backhaul part, especially when we're talking about, say, fiber in such regard. But there are varying rules, national rules, which apply to the degree of sharing of active mobile network infrastructures. As I said, you might be allowed to do MORAN or MOCN, but not necessarily national roaming, or might need to have, say, regulatory approval from the national regulatory authority in such case. And there are also varying national rules applying to minimum coverage obligations, like for the road and also rail transportation networks. So, and that could have an impact on the sharing of mobile network infrastructures. It's like if everyone is, for example, every MNO is required to cover, say, the road or the railroad network with a minimum, like with 100% of a motorway network needs to be covered in one specific country with, say, a minimum of, I don't know, 100 megabits per second in the downlink at the cell edge, then of course you might be, it is probably easier to agree on network sharing, because even on active network sharing, because there is not much of a differentiation play. You are required to cover it anyway, and the coverage obligations might be ambitious anyway. And then, like, partnering and teaming up and cooperating on this one actually does make sense. But it's not the case for all countries across wider Europe. So in such regard, there might be different appetite in players. And there are also other implications. I'll come to this later. And there is, of course, overall, there's a trend to move away a bit from competing on network infrastructures, at least in terms of radio access network infrastructures, to more like competition on services, but also on services and services orchestration. So the flexibility, the agility of a network is to a large degree not only determined by the radio access network, but of course also heavily determined by the core network and its capabilities. And especially when thinking about 5G, which the biggest advantage of 5G overall is the flexibility of reconfiguring and reparameterizing the network to and this is also known as slicing, to have certain kind of features and a certain focus on features for bespoke services or family of services in such regard, and just the famous triangle in terms of enhanced mobile broadband and ultra reliable low latency communication for more or less for mission critical services, and massive IoT. This is just like more or less the top of the iceberg, and there's lots of abilities or capabilities underneath in the network to differentiate the network, including when the radio access. But it is not so much about the radio access coverage and capacity overall in terms of differentiation, but it's more like on the agility of the network itself. So just as a trend. A couple of first and preliminary conclusions I'd like to share with you. It's like, look, cooperation on like one of the 5G pioneer bands, the 3.x gigahertz, so anything from 3.4 to 3.8 basically in Europe, primarily 3.5 to 3.7-ish roughly, and higher. This is where radio access networks need to move closer to the road. So in the past, tower sites have hardly been co-located really close to the road. So they were somewhere even hundreds or kilometers away from the transportation road network in such regard. But moving into higher frequencies, you need to move closer to the road. You have beamforming and all that stuff, and that has some implications. And the same applies, of course, to in previous generations to any kind of RAN deployment in challenging environments. And just to name one is like tunnels. Yeah, this is where you need to move very close to the road, and you need to talk to people who are in charge of operating the road and the associated road infrastructures. So next thing, cooperation between MNOs building their own passive infrastructures, or tower companies and road operators. That is the name of the game, basically, in such regard. And this can be done on either contractual basis between the MNOs or tower companies and road operators, assuming road operators own land and have certain kind of, say, assets, and especially this would be access to energy, electricity, which is important, but also to land, basically, in order to erect poles, towers, masts, whatsoever, and of course a backhaul. Assuming this is, at least there's a trench you could use that already saves quite some money in terms of deploying radio access infrastructures along roads. But if there is already any kind of fiber infrastructure, then of course we would be happy to collaborate with road operators to leverage these assets, at least as long as they are available and unused. So, and that could be done on consortia level or joint ventures or public-private partnerships, whatever is necessary, apart from just renting stuff, basically, which has been done every now and then in the past, as I said, for tunnels. But we need to think about this in a broader sense. And we think like overall tower companies might act as a system integrator or even a catalyst for passive infrastructures, kind of say overcoming the current, say, uncertainty between MNOs and road operators, how to cooperate and how to make it happen, and how to leverage and combine the respective assets. So tower companies will certainly play a pivotal role, at least in this area. And then once you have the passive infrastructures, then MNOs can build very active infrastructures based on these ones, so radio access. And there can be, as I've previously shown, there can be any model from just competing radio access infrastructures up to any form of sharing infrastructures, up to even national roaming or local regional roaming if desirable and also permitted, of course, by the respective NRAs. NRAs are national regulatory authorities in this case. So it's all subject to economic and competition consideration, but also compliance with rules, right? So on a country by country basis. Next, cooperation on active infrastructures. This is something which will remain primarily a decision of the MNOs involved, because they've been ultimately, they've been licensed or have the frequency usage rights and grants. In most instances, you have to pay for it in one way or the other, either in an auction with pretty high prices, but more and more in an auction combined with coverage obligations, not necessarily linked to the respective technology, but linked to certain kind of, say, KPIs. I mentioned, say, 100 megabits per second, and in the future it might be 1 gigabit per second or so, whatever it is. And this has, of course, also certain kind of implications. And then you need to have a certain, say, room to maneuver and to negotiate and consider how you would like to deploy your network. But there is, of course, limited space on passive infrastructures along, not only along the roads, mast poles, gantries you might want to use, and also electric power is also limited. And this is likely to call for some sort of, say, more active RAN sharing in order to make it happen. And of course, also tower companies are moving from at least considering, and you might have heard a couple of announcements, including the one from Cellnex, to say like, yeah, we are neutral host, but not only for passive infrastructures, but we might also become a neutral host for certain active parts of the infrastructures, which is okay, yeah, why not? But in any case, any kind of active RAN sharing requires really consensus and alignment on coverage capacity and lots of technical requirements. And it ultimately, it also depends and needs to match with the spectrum assets owned by the MNOs involved. Just to give you one example, if you have an MNO who is only, say, below 1 gigahertz spectrum, and the other has only spectrum in the, say, 3.x gigahertz space, then there is only limited common ground for network sharing and deployment, at least not on all sites, yeah, in such regard. So it has some implications. Some additional aspects I'd like to share with you is like, yeah, ultimately, and probably George, you will be heavily nodding here, 5G for CAM needs to support seamless cross-border connectivity, also known as handover. Ultimately, yeah, we might need to go via network reselection, other stuff to accelerate it, but ultimately we want to have a seamless connectivity for automatic mobility across the border. But different cooperation models on the respective sites, especially when it comes to active infrastructures, they might imply some additional complexity in order to make it work cross borders, right? In terms of, think of stuff using national roaming or MORAN or MOCN type of sharing on one side and a different model on the other side, and then agreeing on how to implement and include then handover and stuff, and how to agree to this on this one. And that has a certain roots also in the cooperation model, because normally everything stops at the border. So the only thing like going across the border up to now is like, okay, international roaming, right? But that's a different beast, which is currently, which has started to evolve beyond just, okay, you pick which type of generation or which type of, say, basic services are being supported, like circuit switched voice in the past, yeah, and SMS, and then came packet switch data, and can you have 4G, and can you have, if 4G, can you then enjoy voice over LTE working seamlessly, not seamlessly, but in a roaming case and stuff. So this is the stuff which has evolved, and now we are talking about more or less preparing the grounds for network slicing cross border in a 5G case. But first, we have to ensure that, of course, 5G capability may be used by when crossing the border and using the partner networks on that end. starting with non-standalone and then evolving to 5G standalone ultimately. So lots of aspects in such regard. So adding additional complexity. And of course, this is no NRA bashing I'd like to do here, but they need to change and expand the harmonized roles for cross-border coordination. For the time being, it's like, do not radiate into your cross the border basically, and if so, then you need to agree with the owner of the frequency on the other side of the border that you're not using the same frequency, so you're not creating any kind of interference. And to give you a rather bad example, unfortunately, a very recent one and now a phenomenon across Europe is like exactly for the 5G 3.x pioneer band, we have at least two, in theory even three competing schemes how to orchestrate and coordinate the uplink, downlink, and synchronization pattern. And of course, if this is not coordinated at the border, it will create lots of interference, if not even no usability of the respective spectrum at the borders. Yeah. Just as an example, this is the case between France and Germany. It's just one example. It's not the only one. Yeah, and that's also something which needs to, and it has an influence on the coordination, but also on the cooperation models in some regard. And then, since cooperation doesn't stop with, say, with radio access or network infrastructures as we know them, we all know that along with 4G came the first ideas of using edge cloud or mobile edge computing or multi-access edge computing, as it's now being called. And this is computing capability and capacity inside a network, or more or less embedded in the network, and that's a new thing. But my point is, and that's an additional aspect, the CAM services ecosystem is really like, it's still like, yeah, it still has its teething problems, I would say. We just don't know who is going to provide CAM services, what is the level of, say, liability, obligation, and whatsoever. But these are likely to use edge cloud and multi-access edge infrastructures, especially if these services are really subject to latency considerations. Then this might have an impact. But we can currently, it's a bit difficult to really consider cooperation models for the provision of any kind of edge cloud areas in that space. The initial one which have been tackled then are probably all tackled or at least mentioned and considered by the 3 ICT 18 projects involved is like, yeah, would you do it per MNO or shared between MNOs, potentially also involving road operators and other players, or will the edge cloud environment be just provided by third parties, whatever the third parties are in such regard, but having a shortcut into the respective MNO networks, right? And then the next question would be like, okay, shared cross-border? Could be interesting, right? So lots of aspects, but I would say compared to the other one in terms of the network itself, this is not as straightforward as the cooperation models for passive and active infrastructure sharing. Now, my summary and outlook. As I said, straightforward, passive and infrastructures. It's like only adding the road operator to the ecosystem and into the equation. And we primarily see them in the passive infrastructure game in some regard. While the cooperation models for edge cloud and MEC are still unclear, or we need to address them in a generic way, and then as soon as, say, the CAM services landscape becomes more clear, then we can embed the respective cooperation models and also have the corresponding deployment cross borders and along the 10T corridors. And the last thing I'd like to mention is like this expert group from the 5G PPPP Automotive Working Group will release its report by the end of April in terms of cooperation models for 5G for CAM. And this ends my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Edwin, for the excellent presentation from the cooperation models point of view. Now we will have a short session to handle the questions and some discussions that we may see. Olga, can I ask you to take the floor on this? And a reminder for the audience, there's a questions box in the tool that you can use to ask questions to the presenters, to the panel. Olga, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Koen. So we would like to hear from you regarding any questions that you might have. We already have some comments in the chat, so I will kindly ask George to make the start because he has made some comments regarding the value network model and the liabilities. George? Can you hear us, or should I read from the chat?
Yeah, just read it from the chat if George is not able to enable his audio.
Okay, so George had some comments regarding the complexity of the value network model. So this is, in fact, a very real problem, as George is pointing out, that the value network model becomes quite complex. And this creates also additional problems when it comes to the variety of different agreements that would exist between these entities, whether they are bilateral or multilateral agreements. And that also has the side effect that these agreements bring specific liabilities. And how do you even begin to monitor for breaches in such an environment that is so complex?
Yeah.
So this creates a very important dilemma here, because the way that this network model could be simplified would be either to reduce the number of connections between the different stakeholders, which unfortunately would mean that the national authorities would have to regulate the sector very heavily, and that is not something that would be perhaps the best idea. Or you need to facilitate these, the existence of these agreements and these relationships, and not just facilitate them for the sake of the stakeholders that are participating in terms of the liabilities and etc., but also make them very transparent, not just for the sake of the application providers, but also for the sake of the customers themselves. Because in these cases, you would have cases where joint controllers would be needed when it comes to the data that are being exchanged between the CAM service and the 5G. So that would in turn means that this sort of ecosystem needs to be transparent also for the driver and the user of the CAM service.
Yeah. If I may, just to emphasize this aspect of complexity, when I look at some of the nice diagrams that you showed during the various presentations, and now at the end, Edwin, in terms of the cooperation models, they are extremely complex. If you think that anyone will be able to even understand this and be able to address all the different interfaces, it's utterly impossible. So there needs to be someone dealing with this so that it becomes transparent. First, for the application developers, we need to allow people to develop applications for CAM, 5G for CAM, but also even for interinstitutional or inter-operator or whatever. If there are too many degrees of freedom, it will be extremely complex, and in the end, there is no guarantee that that connectivity will be seamless. And that's, again, it's my main point. Seamless connectivity, continuity of service across borders. It's our major challenge, and this complexity is not helping it. Anyway, sorry for that.
No, I agree. At least in my view, the only way to sort of start addressing this would be to assign more power and more roles to the national regulating authorities. like for example, although it is something that is dealing mostly with the cybersecurity aspects, there is a 5G toolbox that suggests that the national regulating authorities need to be able to enforce some rules when it comes to the relationship between the telco providers and the equipment manufacturers, the suppliers like Nokia and Ericsson, etc. So the only thing here is that the national regulating authority needs to have this sort of power in order to assert some control on, let's say, the procurement processes. So this is
but you see, Olga, sorry, but this, I don't think this is enough. When you start to look into the role of the road operators, which, by the way, are controlled in many countries by a different ministry, this is just adding trouble to this picture, huh? Because there is no way the telecom minister is going to impose stuff to the transportation ministers. This is not going to happen. So I don't know how to resolve this, but we are adding a lot of stakeholders to an already complicated picture, and I think someone needs to start simplifying it. Okay, creating simpler instantiations with a reduced number of interfaces, because otherwise this becomes unmanageable. Even within the same country, it becomes unmanageable. So
yes, it is true, because other than having these multiple types of stakeholders, you have multiple stakeholders within this category, and they create a competitive environment on their own. So this problem can only become worse. So the main thing is that how do we even start to solve this problem? On the technical side, let's say that you have some way to enforce, say, monitoring of such contracts between the different entities. Let's say that in the national regulator side, they have some power to address some of these issues, but it's also, as you say, that it's not one single national authority. It might be multiple ones regarding the 5G aspects, regarding the transport aspects. So this is a very complex ecosystem, and it's a very big problem on how to actually bring these people together in order to cooperate. At least in my view, it would start by clearing up the idea of exactly what the national regulators are expected to do, and going from that to the rest of the aspects that need to be transparent or regulated or monitored, etc. But the first step would be to have very clear picture on exactly what are the powers that need to be assigned to the national regulating authorities in the transport sector, in the 5G and the telecommunication sector, etc.
yeah, but just to give you a concrete example, if we open the opportunity for the road operators to become a neutral host, providing giving access to their own communication infrastructure, then they become a telecom operator. Okay, and then they have to respond simultaneously to the Ministry of Transport and to the Ministry of Telecommunications. And it might be because this was never really considered, that the rules are conflicting. Okay, and again, this is something that is likely to happen in at least one or two member states. So how are we going to address this? It's all very nice that the objective is the single digital market, okay, but we cannot even have non-conflicting rules within the same member states. So yeah, this, I'm just saying, okay, this is something that we will have eventually to face. I would again, and this is obviously the purpose of the Horizon 2020, I would focus on the technological problems first. But I think the work you have done, the MOBIX and the projects and the 5G PPP working group, is extremely relevant in also identifying potential, I would say, very likely problems. So yes, okay.
Yeah, I think we make a very interesting point on whether the transport operator will need to be a telecommunications operator essentially or not. And it is, I think, important to note that there is not alignment between the member states exactly on whether that is necessary or not. Because, for example, in Greece, we had auctions that are very specific on the eligibility criteria, and it's only telcos that can participate and bid for spectrum. Whereas in Germany, there was a different approach that allowed the part of the spectrum to be auctioned off to different verticals. And that included transport and manufacturing, if I remember correctly. So the approach among the different member states on this is not the same. And as, for example, in Greece, it might not be feasible for a transport operator to have this duplicitous role as a telco operator.
With Edwin, just for clarification, we say the reservation of almost 100 megahertz of dedicated 3.7 gigahertz spectrum for verticals basically was limited to so-called campus networks. So by no means an entity, even say, let's think a second of the, say, a national railroad operator was in no way entitled to apply for getting this spectrum to cover all of the railroad network, for example, in Germany. No, that is not the case. It's like everyone was entitled, and even the transportation sector was entitled to apply, or is entitled to apply for frequencies just used either indoors or within, say, your premises, which could be and it does not, it must not be something which has, call it, public access. So, and by this they are not bound to say to any kind of telecommunication rules, like, I don't know, lawful interception and whatsoever. So that's probably a different thing. And the second thing I wanted to respond to George is like, well, potentially a way forward for avoiding that road operators would have to become telco players, just because they might open their fiber assets to be used in parts of a neutral host approach. This does not necessarily constitute a telecommunications service, and if it doesn't constitute a telecommunications service, then it's just like, okay, providing a stretch of, which happens to be fiber or any other kind of cable, basically between point A and B, and at both endpoints, the telco player has to plug it into their respective premises in order to enable a telco service. Then I would probably argue that the road operator would not have to abide to telecommunication rules. The other thing is, of course, one might just source or rent the fiber link in this regard, and then it's just you're renting it, and it's just an asset which does not constitute a telecommunication service. Just an idea, but
Yeah.
of course, the tricky part is you have to take it piece by piece and case by case with all respective member states or countries to go beyond just the EU 27. That's of course a major pain point, but it could be addressed not on a cross trans-European or pan-European level, but this can be addressed case by case, where applicable on national or even regional level, I would say. rather than attempting a generic one-size-fits-all rule for everyone, pragmatically speaking.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to add, as the conversation is David Fidalgo here, on the complexity you mentioned with the regulators and the different stakeholders, I think a good way to think about to reduce the complexity is thinking that the all common denominator of all the stakeholders that Ty presented is data. And basically, it's interesting to understand as well how we can governance data to allow these interactions between the different stakeholders, to reduce the complexity as well, because the main complexity on all these things is how we actually structure the data and creating a data governance structure. So basically understanding as well that every single country will have challenges in regulations, right? But providing that particular data governing structure for the different governments to manage as well the interactions between both of them, because at the end of the day, it's the main challenge that we're having if we put in the network operators, the OEM, if we're putting everybody in the stakeholders, is the data structures as well, that it was the ones that will actually be judged for the regulators.
So
Yeah.
yeah, just one question, because I really want to highlight this. We keep talking about roaming and agreements between MNOs, but I don't think this applies yet to data roaming, and much less real-time data roaming. So the question I asked is anyone looking into this at the level of the operators, or maybe even at the level of standardization? Is there something missing before we would be able to really enable real-time data roaming across Europe?
If I might start attempting an answer, this is Edwin. Well, bottom up, I would say, yeah, we start, and that starts with say the GSMA activities related to network slicing and slicing templates as a cross-border or cross-MNO agreement, more or less, for allowing really real-time data and mission-critical data being. But now the tricky thing comes to be transported. We are only looking at the transportation, so really as at the transportation of data and all the prerequisites in order to allow this data flow. But we are not looking at it really from a data or data access and data sharing perspective. So from the service level, from the top level, we keep stuck in the more or less in the transportation realm. And in this case, transportation means transporting data, not transporting people or goods. But you know what I mean? It's like obviously there is a missing link. And what I've seen from David is, I believe, David, you are really tackling the top-down view in terms of, call it, free flow of data, and which is necessary, and including, of course, for the mission critical stuff in connected and automated mobility. Think of level 4 and beyond when it's mission critical, like level 4 requirement, like 10 milliseconds end to end, which probably goes even beyond the current capabilities of 5G networks. But put it aside, yeah, it is really more about the free flow of data between all stakeholders in order to have a connected and automated mobility ecosystem, make it work across Europe.
And Edwin, just to clarify that, is the data governance and rules of the data, because you're actually talking about data transition, but basically you need to collect the data and have a governance to understand how you can move the data, right? Because that's basically when regulation is starting to pick in, or when you can solve the problem of the multiple stakeholders having challenge with contradicting regulations, for example, is across borders, is yeah, but basically I have a structure in all the process of extracting the data, capture the data, then is moving the data, right? But basically the packages of data actually are structured in the sense that you're creating a governance, so basically everybody can take their own regulation to it, but everybody will speak the same languages, right? Because at the end of the day, the problem with this is, I always said that data is the new language to validate things and communicate between different stakeholders. At some point, the future is going to be that particular data. So in order to validate it and for traceability and for rules, you need to have a kind of like a package of data that is basically governments, and it's common in Europe, right? Because at the end of the day, you have different, if every single country have different data packaging, for example, the transition is actually create more complexity and understanding of the data, creating more complexity to us applying regulations into it.
Yeah, but again, allow me to go back to the issue of complexity. If you present to the lawyers this picture just with so many stakeholders, and within the stakeholders such a variety, a whole set of MNOs, a whole set of OEMs, a whole set of this, they are going to say, how can we legislate anything for this complexity? So that's when you say governance, you are trying, I understand you are trying to hide the complexity of all of this, but legislation needs to reflect this, in some sense, this reality, because otherwise there will be so many loopholes that it doesn't make any sense, and it will not be effective. I think we have to go back to this issue of complexity versus governance versus we want competition, but we cannot allow really for any type of agreements. Okay, if you leave everything open, it will be inherently complex, and legislation to apply to this complexity will be a nightmare. So it will not be implemented either. So maybe we need to start with some associations, and if an association work, I would say this is the ITF model. You implement something, and if it works, you show it works, then it can be used by anyone without any need for a justification. Okay, and you can build additional things like this, because if you just leave, anyone can use these interfaces and come up with ad hoc agreements, it will be such a patchwork that you cannot ensure end-to-end continuity. Okay, even if you restrict it to a specific border, you cannot ensure it. There are so many players that you need to check with, that then it becomes unpractical. Anyway, so we need to deal with complexities sometime.
Thanks, George, for your words on this. I totally agree. If it was simple, then we would already have had this